1332 dawned with the southeastern shores of the Sea of Marmara, smoldering under relentless Byzantine harassment as imperial naval vessels launched another in an endless series of raids against Ottoman coastal settlements, burning fishing villages, scattering merchant caravans, and testing the defenses of newly established Turkish communities, with a persistence that revealed the Byzantine Empire's fundamental refusal to accept Ottoman expansion even when lacking sufficient military power to reverse it decisively. Sultan Orhan Ghazi, now 44 years old and governing an Ottoman state that had grown enormously to the conquests of Bursa, Nicaea, and numerous smaller Byzantine towns, found himself confronting a strategic reality that no amount of territorial victory could entirely resolve. The Byzantine Empire, though thoroughly weakened and unable to mount the kind of massive military campaigns that might genuinely threaten Ottoman existence, possessed enough residual naval and military capability to conduct constant low-intensity operations that wore on Ottoman resources, disrupted newly established governance, and forced the expanding Turkish state to maintain expensive defensive postures along dozens of vulnerable frontiers simultaneously. These were not the grand battles that chroniclers recorded in detail and that historians later elevated to the status of civilization-altering events, but rather the grinding, unglamorous, perpetually ongoing conflict that actually consumed the majority of Ottoman military resources and attention during the entire period of expansion. A war fought in hundreds of small engagements that collectively shaped the empire's development as profoundly as any single dramatic victory. The nature of Byzantine resistance to Ottoman expansion during the 1330s and 40s evolved continuously as the empire's military capabilities declined, but its strategic creativity and desperation intensified, producing a complex pattern of harassment, ambushes, naval raids, alliance building, and opportunistic counterattacks that required Ottoman commanders to develop defensive capabilities alongside their more celebrated offensive operations. The Byzantine approach to this ongoing low-intensity conflict reflected both institutional memory of centuries as the Mediterranean's dominant military power and pragmatic adaptation to the reality that the empire could no longer field armies capable of meeting Ottoman forces in open battle with any expectation of favorable outcome. Instead, Byzantine military efforts concentrated on exploiting specific advantages: naval superiority in certain waters, knowledge of local terrain, ability to strike suddenly and withdraw before Ottoman response materialized, and capacity to organize temporary coalitions of allied forces against specific Ottoman positions to create maximum disruption, with minimum risk of the catastrophic defeats that had characterized previous Byzantine attempts at major military operations against the Ottomans. The Byzantine naval harassment campaigns that constituted perhaps the most persistent and annoying form of coalition resistance operated throughout the 1330s, with a rhythm that Ottoman coastal defenders quickly came to recognize. Calm periods when Byzantine vessels withdrew to refit or respond to other priorities were invariably followed by intense periods of raids during which imperial fleets struck simultaneously at multiple Ottoman targets, preventing any single location from receiving adequate reinforcement. The raids varied in scale from small boats carrying perhaps 20 men raiding isolated fishing settlements to substantial naval expeditions involving dozens of vessels and several thousand soldiers, targeting fortified ports or the newly established caravanserais where merchants stored valuable goods. The pattern required Ottoman forces to maintain constant coastal vigilance, garrison every significant port and vulnerable stretch of coastline, and develop early warning systems that could alert distant forces when naval attacks materialized. These defensive requirements consumed significant military resources and attention that might otherwise have been directed toward offensive expansion, illustrating how constant low-intensity conflict could burden an expanding power even when no individual engagement posed existential threat. The alliance networks that Byzantine authorities cultivated among other Christian powers and even among rival Turkish beyliks created additional layers of military challenge for the Ottomans during this extended period of defensive warfare. Emperor Andronicus II and his successors systematically explored diplomatic possibilities for organizing coalitions that might coordinate against Ottoman expansion, offering various inducements to potential allies including crucial privileges, territorial concessions, and military assistance against their own enemies that might be provided in exchange for participation in anti-Ottoman operations. The alliances that resulted, though never producing the kind of massive coordinated military response that might seriously threaten Ottoman existence, nonetheless created situations where Ottoman forces faced simultaneous pressure from multiple directions requiring dispersal of limited military resources. Venetian naval squadrons occasionally intervened in Aegean operations. Serbian military forces made probing attacks against Ottoman allied territories, and even some Turkish beyliks that had previously maintained neutral or friendly relations with the Ottomans, occasionally provided military support for Byzantine operations against their common neighbor. Managing these diverse threats required Ottoman diplomacy and military planning to operate on multiple fronts simultaneously. The human dimension of this perpetual low-intensity warfare, the daily experience of soldiers, sailors, administrators, and civilians living in the zone of constant conflict between Ottoman expansion and Byzantine resistance, revealed realities of medieval warfare that grand narratives of empire building obscure. Ottoman coastal defenders lived in constant state of alert, sleeping with weapons beside them and maintaining watch rotations that eroded sleep and health over months and years. Fishermen and farmers along vulnerable coastlines conducted their essential work while maintaining awareness of potential Byzantine naval attack that might materialize at any moment, sometimes abandoning crops or catches when alarm signals warned of approaching enemy vessels. Merchants traveling between Ottoman territories accepted elevated risks of interception by Byzantine patrols and included those risks in their calculations of profitable trade routes and fair prices. The communities established in recently conquered territories, composed of both Turkish settlers and Greek Christian populations, lived with the knowledge that they occupied contested ground whose ultimate control remained uncertain despite Ottoman military dominance, creating an atmosphere of anxiety and impermanence that affected daily decisions about investment, settlement, and long-term planning. The Ottoman military organizational response to the challenge of defending multiple fronts simultaneously while continuing offensive expansion revealed institutional development that would characterize the empire's governance for centuries. Orhan established regional military commands responsible for defending specific geographic sectors while maintaining coordination with central military planning that could concentrate forces against more significant threats. The Timar system, originally conceived primarily as a mechanism for financing and organizing offensive military forces, evolved to serve defensive purposes as well, with Timur holders assigned responsibilities for defending their territories against Byzantine raids and maintaining readiness to respond to threats in neighboring regions. The construction of fortifications along vulnerable coastlines and at strategic interior points created physical infrastructure of defense that could reduce the number of mobile forces required to protect against raids while providing secure bases from which counterattacks could be launched. These organizational innovations, driven by the necessity of managing constant Byzantine harassment while maintaining sufficient offensive capability for continued expansion, transformed the Ottoman military system from a primarily offensive force into a sophisticated military establishment capable of simultaneously conducting offensive and defensive operations across extensive territories. 1335 through 1338 witnessed the most intense period of Byzantine naval harassment against Ottoman coastal territories, as imperial naval forces conducted a systematic campaign designed to disrupt Ottoman consolidation of recently conquered regions and demonstrate that Turkish control of Marmara coastline would never be secure. The Byzantine naval operations during this period combined multiple objectives beyond simple military destruction of Ottoman forces or facilities. They aimed to prevent Turkish settlement of coastal regions by creating conditions too dangerous for civilian populations to remain, to disrupt maritime commerce that provided Ottoman treasury with revenues funding military expansion, to demonstrate to other Byzantine territories still under imperial control that the empire retained sufficient military capability to contest Turkish dominance, and to maintain psychological pressure on Ottoman populations and leadership that sustained awareness of continued Byzantine threat. These operations, though individually modest in scale, accumulated over months and years to create cumulative strategic effect that demanded Ottoman attention and resources far exceeding what any single Byzantine raid could justify. The Venetian naval intervention in Aegean and Marmara operations during the mid-1330s added another dimension to the Byzantine coalition against Ottoman expansion that complicated Ottoman strategic calculations and required diplomatic as well as military responses. The Republic of Venice, whose commercial empire depended on maritime trade routes that passed through waters increasingly dominated by Ottoman-allied Turkish forces, viewed Ottoman expansion with combination of concern about long-term threats to Venetian commercial interests and pragmatic recognition that Venetians could sometimes exploit anti-Ottoman operations for their own commercial and political advantage. Venetian naval squadrons provided Byzantine fleets with experienced crews, sophisticated vessels, and tactical expertise that significantly enhanced imperial naval capabilities during their periods of involvement. The relationship between Venice and Byzantium regarding anti-Ottoman naval operations proved complex and frequently opportunistic, with the Venetians participating enthusiastically when operations promised profitable returns in plunder, captured ships, or commercial privileges, while withdrawing when operations appeared costly or when Venetian relations with potential Ottoman trading partners seemed more valuable than alliance with declining Byzantine Empire. The Ottoman naval response to sustained Byzantine and Venetian harassment campaigns demonstrated how military necessity drove organizational development and technological innovation far more effectively than peacetime planning ever could. Faced with the reality that naval attacks against Ottoman coastal territories would continue indefinitely unless adequate defensive naval capability was developed, Orhan invested heavily in expanding Ottoman fleet beyond the modest force assembled during Qurayshi annexation, commissioning construction of vessels specifically designed for defensive operations, including patrol boats capable of rapid movement along coastline to intercept raiders, larger warships suitable for engaging Byzantine naval forces in the confined waters of the Marmara, and transport vessels that could quickly move reinforcements between threatened positions. The ships were crewed by a mixture of Turkish warriors seeking maritime experience and Greek Christian sailors recruited into Ottoman service, creating a naval establishment whose composition reflected the pragmatic approach to talent utilization that characterized Ottoman military development. The vessels were positioned at strategic harbors along the Ottoman coastline, their crews maintained at constant readiness, and communication systems established connecting coastal watch posts with naval bases to enable rapid response when Byzantine raids materialized. The engagement patterns between Byzantine naval raiders and Ottoman coastal defenders evolved over the years of sustained conflict as both sides adapted tactics and capabilities to counter each other's innovations. Early Byzantine raids achieved considerable success when Ottoman coastal defenses were inadequately developed, catching newly established settlements unprepared and inflicting significant damage to communities that had not yet developed effective warning and response systems. Yet as Ottoman defenses matured, Byzantine raiders found operations becoming progressively more costly and dangerous as coastal watch systems provided earlier warning. Garrison forces responded more quickly and effectively, and Ottoman naval forces increasingly intercepted Byzantine vessels before they could complete raids and withdraw. The evolving tactical dance between attackers and defenders drove innovation on both sides. Byzantine raiders developed more sophisticated assault techniques, employed decoys and diversions to draw Ottoman defenders out of position, and conducted intelligence gathering to identify vulnerable targets before launching operations. Ottoman defenders correspondingly improved early warning systems, developed rapid response protocols that concentrated forces against actual threats while maintaining defense against potential diversions, and refined coastal fortification designs to withstand Byzantine naval bombardment. The psychological dimensions of the perpetual Byzantine harassment campaign extended beyond immediate military consequences to affect broader Ottoman governance and population dynamics in contested regions. Turkish settlers who had established farms and communities along Ottoman coastline lived in constant awareness that Byzantine naval attack might materialize at any time, disrupting agricultural work, requiring periodic evacuation of families to interior positions, and creating an atmosphere of insecurity that discouraged the kind of long-term investment and development that stable governance was intended to enable. Greek Christian populations in the same regions faced additional complexity of living under Turkish Muslim governance while witnessing Byzantine forces attempting to liberate them, creating divided loyalties that Ottoman administrators struggled to manage without alienating populations whose cooperation was essential for effective governance. The cumulative psychological effect of years of intermittent Byzantine attacks and Ottoman defensive operations was constant, low-level anxiety that colored every aspect of coastal life, and that no amount of military success in defending against individual raids could entirely eliminate as long as Byzantine naval capability persisted. The intelligence warfare conducted by both sides during the years of coastal harassment revealed sophisticated information gathering and counterintelligence capabilities that contradicted simplistic assumptions about medieval military operations lacking the sophistication of modern intelligence services. Byzantine agents, recruited from Greek Christian populations living under Ottoman governance, or maintaining commercial contacts with Ottoman territories, provided imperial authorities with detailed information about Ottoman garrison strengths, naval patrol schedules, fortification weaknesses, and supply situations that enabled raiders to choose targets with maximum vulnerability and minimum risk. Ottoman counterintelligence efforts attempted to identify and neutralize Byzantine agents within their own territories while simultaneously cultivating intelligence sources among Byzantine populations and ally foreign merchants who could provide warning about planned naval operations. The intelligence contest between Byzantine and Ottoman forces proved as important as the military engagements themselves in determining the ongoing conflict's outcomes, as information advantages could compensate for military inferiority, while intelligence failures could doom even numerically superior forces to embarrassing defeats. 1338 through 1342 witnessed the Byzantine Empire attempting to organize increasingly ambitious coalition military operations against Ottoman expansion, moving beyond purely naval harassment to envision combined land and sea campaigns that might create sufficient pressure on multiple Ottoman fronts to force withdrawal from recently conquered territories or at least halt further expansion. The coalition-building efforts revealed both Byzantine diplomatic sophistication in identifying and cultivating potential allies, and the fundamental limitations of organizing effective military cooperation among powers whose interests frequently conflicted and whose cooperation could never be assumed reliable beyond the immediate convenience each participant calculated. Emperor Andronikos III, before his death in 1341, invested significant diplomatic energy and scarce financial resources in cultivating relationships with potential coalition partners, sending embassies throughout the Byzantine world and beyond seeking allies willing to contribute military forces, naval capabilities, or at minimum financial support for anti-Ottoman operations. The emperor's diplomatic correspondence, preserved in Byzantine archives and analyzed by historians examining the period's diplomatic dynamics, reveals surprisingly sophisticated understanding of how to appeal to different potential allies' specific interests and concerns, while maintaining sufficiently honest assessment of Byzantine capabilities to avoid alienating partners who subsequently discovered that imperial promises exceeded imperial capacity for delivery. The Serbian kingdom, under Tsar Stefan Dušan, represented perhaps the most significant potential ally for Byzantine anti-Ottoman coalition operations during the late 1330s and early 1340s. As Serbia's powerful military establishment and Dušan's imperial ambitions created apparent alignment of interests with the Byzantine need to resist Turkish expansion, the Serbian Tsar, who had conquered substantial Byzantine territories in the Balkans and dreamed of eventually conquering Constantinople itself, viewed Ottoman expansion as a potential long-term threat to his own imperial ambitions, even while recognizing immediate benefits of Byzantine weakness that enabled Serbian territorial expansion at imperial expense. Byzantine diplomats attempted to leverage shared Christian religious affinity and the common threat posed by Ottoman military power to negotiate Serbian military support for anti-Ottoman operations, offering various inducements including territorial concessions, commercial privileges, and military alliance arrangements. Yet Dušan's strategic calculations proved more sophisticated than simple Christian solidarity, as the Serbian Tsar recognized that Ottoman forces fighting the Byzantines for him required no Serbian participation, and that committing Serbian military resources to defending Byzantine territories that Serbia might eventually wish to conquer itself served no obvious Serbian interest. The alliance negotiations between Serbia and Byzantium regarding anti-Ottoman operations produced extensive diplomatic exchange but minimal concrete military cooperation. The Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, provided the Byzantine coalition's most capable naval forces when they chose to participate, but simultaneously demonstrated the fundamental unreliability of alliance partners whose participation depended primarily on commercial calculations rather than religious solidarity or strategic commitment. Venetian naval interventions against Ottoman coastal operations occurred during periods when Venetian commercial interests appeared threatened by Turkish expansion, ceased when Ottoman authorities offered commercial concessions that made continued hostile operations unnecessary, and resumed when new developments suggested that Ottoman cooperation had become commercially disadvantageous. This on-again, off-again Venetian participation required Byzantine military planners to develop operational plans that could proceed regardless of whether Italian naval forces would be available, creating strategic uncertainty that complicated anti-Ottoman coordination. Genoa, Venice's primary commercial rival, maintained even more complex relationships with both Byzantium and the Ottoman state, sometimes supporting Byzantine operations when Genoa judged that Venetian commercial dominance could be undermined through Turkish expansion, while other times maintaining neutral or even friendly relations with Ottoman authorities when commercial opportunities presented themselves. The Bulgarian kingdom and various smaller Balkan principalities presented Byzantine coalition building with a combination of potential military contributions and diplomatic complications that complicated rather than simplified the organizational challenge of coordinating anti-Ottoman resistance. Bulgarian military forces, while considerably less powerful than Serbian armies, could contribute meaningful numbers of additional warriors to coalition operations and could threaten Ottoman territories from directions that required Turkish forces to maintain expensive defensive postures regardless of whether actual Bulgarian attacks materialized. Yet Bulgarian strategic interests frequently conflicted with those of both Byzantium and Serbia, as the Bulgarian kingdom occupied intermediate geographic position between these more powerful neighbors and could not afford to alienate either without risking territorial losses to whichever became dominant. Bulgarian participation in anti-Ottoman coalitions therefore depended on careful diplomatic balancing that preserved relationships with both Byzantium and Serbia while obtaining maximum military benefit from Ottoman weakness, a balancing act that produced inconsistent coalition contributions and strategic unpredictability. The practical challenges of coordinating military operations among coalition partners whose geographic positions, military capabilities, strategic interests, and domestic political situations varied enormously proved as significant as the military capabilities the coalition could theoretically assemble. Communication between widely dispersed coalition partners took days or weeks, even under ideal conditions, creating situations where military operations planned months in advance by coalition coordinators required adaptation when they encountered different conditions than those anticipated. Yet coordination mechanisms were too slow to communicate change plans to all participating forces before they had already committed to operations based on outdated information. The linguistic diversity of coalition partners, Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, Italian, and various other languages complicated diplomatic communication and created potential for misunderstandings that could prove militarily significant. Most fundamentally, the tendency of alliance partners to prioritize their own strategic interests over coalition objectives meant that coordination consistently eroded as operations continued, with participants withdrawing forces to address their own threats rather than maintaining commitment to coalition objectives, when circumstances made those objectives seem less immediately valuable than protecting their own territories. The Ottoman response to Byzantine coalition-building efforts demonstrated sophisticated diplomatic skill in identifying and exploiting coalition partners' conflicting interests to prevent effective cooperation while maintaining sufficiently threatening military posture to prevent any single ally from withdrawing entirely. Ottoman diplomats maintained active communication with each coalition partner separately, offering commercial privileges, territorial assurances, and even military assistance against those partners' enemies unrelated to Ottoman-Byzantine conflict, creating webs of bilateral relationship that complicated coalition partners' ability to maintain unified strategic position. The strategy of divide and influence, familiar to any student of imperial power politics, proved extraordinarily effective against coalitions held together primarily by convenience rather than existential threat, as Ottoman diplomatic efforts consistently found and exploited the fault lines between alliance partners' interests that coalition coordination could never entirely smooth. Each time Byzantine authorities appeared close to organizing an effective coalition operation against Ottoman positions, Ottoman diplomats addressed the concerns of key coalition partners individually, offering concessions that persuaded them to withdraw or reduce their participation, dissolving coalition military capability without Ottoman forces needing to defeat it on the battlefield. 1340 through 1345 witnessed intensification of land-based Byzantine resistance operations along the frontiers of Ottoman-controlled territories, as imperial military planners recognized that naval harassment alone could not prevent Ottoman consolidation of conquered regions, and that land-based operations, ambushes, raids, counterattacks against isolated Ottoman positions, and attacks on supply lines might inflict significant damage on the expanding Turkish state, even when successful defense of entire territories against Ottoman siege proved impossible. The Byzantine land-based resistance operations represented a fundamentally different type of military challenge for the Ottomans than the naval campaigns had posed, requiring development of interior defense capabilities, including intelligence networks monitoring Byzantine movements, alert systems enabling rapid concentration of forces against threats, garrison organizations capable of defending static positions while mobile forces were deployed, and counter-raiding capabilities that could strike Byzantine staging areas and supply routes to reduce their ability to sustain offensive operations. The ambushes that Byzantine forces launched against Ottoman supply convoys and administrative officials traveling between conquered towns represented perhaps the most persistent and disruptive form of land-based resistance, as these operations required relatively modest military forces but could inflict disproportionate damage by targeting the logistical arteries on which Ottoman governance depended. Ottoman supply convoys carrying goods between major centers like Bursa and Nicaea passed through terrain that offered ambushers numerous opportunities to strike, with narrow mountain passes, river crossings, and stretches of dense woodland creating natural bottlenecks where defending convoys against determined attack proved extremely difficult. The threat of ambush forced the Ottoman authorities to provide substantial military escorts for convoys that consumed resources which might otherwise have been available for offensive operations, while occasional successful Byzantine ambushes destroyed goods, killed experienced Ottoman officers, and disrupted administrative communications in ways that temporarily hampered governance of recently conquered territories. The Ottoman response included both military measures, strengthening escort forces, developing intelligence about Byzantine ambush positions, and constructing fortified waypoints along major routes and administrative adaptations, including decentralization of governance to reduce dependence on convoys for essential supplies and information. The Byzantine counterattacks against isolated Ottoman garrisons and recently conquered towns and fortresses revealed both the persistence of Christian resistance to Turkish governance and the vulnerability of occupation forces that were never sufficient in numbers to simultaneously defend against external attack and maintain internal control over potentially hostile populations. Several Ottoman garrisons holding recently captured Byzantine fortresses faced attacks combining external Byzantine military forces approaching from surrounding territories with internal uprisings by Greek Christian populations who had been watching Byzantine military preparations and hoped to coordinate their own resistance with imperial counterattack. The attacks, though individually modest in scale, demonstrated that Ottoman conquest was not universally accepted by occupied populations, and that the conversion of military conquest to stable governance remained an ongoing process, rather than an accomplished fact regardless of how effectively Ottoman policies promoted tolerance and fair treatment. The intelligence required to detect and prevent these combined external attack and internal uprising scenarios demanded sophisticated monitoring of both Byzantine military movements and local population sentiment, capabilities that Ottoman intelligence services developed through years of experience managing conquered populations. The mounted warfare that occurred along the extensive frontiers between Ottoman-controlled territories and remaining Byzantine regions demonstrated the military capabilities that both sides had developed through decades of constant conflict, creating a zone of perpetual low-intensity combat that neither side could ultimately resolve in their favor without committing resources far exceeding what either deemed appropriate for frontier skirmishes. Byzantine cavalry, including both professional units and aristocratic retainers, conducted raids deep into Ottoman territories seeking plunder, intelligence about Ottoman military dispositions, and opportunities to demonstrate continued Byzantine military capability to populations whose loyalty to the empire might otherwise erode. Ottoman cavalry responded with counter-raids that penetrated Byzantine territory, disrupting enemy preparations for offensive operations while also seeking plunder and information. These cavalry engagements, occurring throughout the year in fair weather and occasionally even during winter months when ground conditions permitted mounted operations, created a pattern of constant military activity that required both sides to maintain operational readiness, while rarely involving forces large enough to achieve decisive military results. The strategic impact of the continuous frontier warfare on Ottoman military development proved significant despite, or perhaps because, of the absence of dramatic climactic engagements that chroniclers found worthy of detailed recording. Ottoman commanders fighting daily against Byzantine resistance on multiple frontiers developed tactical and operational skills refined through constant practical experience that no theoretical military education could replicate. Intelligence gathering evolved from occasional efforts to systematic operations that maintained continuous awareness of enemy capabilities, dispositions, and intentions. Supply systems evolved to sustain operations across extensive territories while maintaining flexibility to respond to the unpredictable requirements of ongoing frontier warfare. Command and communication systems evolved to enable rapid decision-making across dispersed forces responding to threats that materialized without warning and required immediate response. These capabilities developed through years of perpetual low-intensity conflict rather than through single dramatic campaigns, proved as important for Ottoman military success as the more celebrated offensive operations that received greater attention from chroniclers and subsequent historians. The psychological impact of perpetual warfare on both Ottoman and Byzantine military and civilian populations created distinct cultural attitudes toward conflict that influenced how each society understood and related to the military activities consuming such significant proportion of resources and attention. Ottoman military culture developed traditions of continuous readiness, professional commitment, and acceptance that warfare was a permanent condition rather than an exceptional event, creating warriors and administrators who viewed military service not as a temporary duty undertaken during emergencies, but as a fundamental aspect of Ottoman citizenship. Byzantine resistance developed its own cultural traditions emphasizing brave resistance against overwhelming odds, loyalty to Christian civilization despite military defeats, and faith that divine justice would eventually prevail, regardless of earthly military outcomes, creating cultural narratives of heroic resistance that would sustain Byzantine identity, even as the empire's territorial and military position continued deteriorating. These cultural attitudes, shaped by decades of constant conflict, would prove as enduring as any military victory or defeat in determining how each civilization understood its own identity and purpose. 1343 through 1346 witnessed the decisive moment when Byzantine coalition military efforts against Ottoman expansion achieved their maximum intensity only to fail comprehensively through combination of military defeat on the battlefield and diplomatic collapse of the alliance structures that had theoretically provided a framework for coordinated resistance. The failure was not sudden, but rather resulted from accumulated weaknesses that had characterized Byzantine coalition building from the beginning. The fundamental mismatch between ambitious strategic objectives and inadequate military resources available to achieve them. The persistent tendency of alliance partners to prioritize individual interests over coalition objectives. The Turkish diplomatic skill in identifying and exploiting divisions between coalition partners. And ultimately the simple military reality that Ottoman forces had grown stronger through continuous warfare and institutional development, while Byzantine capabilities had declined despite extraordinary efforts to organize effective resistance. The most significant Byzantine coalition military operation during this critical period brought together elements of imperial forces, Serbian auxiliaries who had been induced to participate through diplomatic negotiations, and Venetian naval units into a combined campaign aimed at disrupting Ottoman consolidation of Thracian territories and demonstrating that Christian military forces could still contest Turkish expansion in Europe. The campaign required coordinating land forces advancing from Serbian-controlled territories, with naval forces conducting operations in the Sea of Marmara and Mediterranean, creating situations where Ottoman positions could potentially be threatened from multiple directions simultaneously. The coordination requirements proved extraordinarily challenging, given the communication limitations of medieval military operations, the different operational timelines appropriate to land and naval campaigns, and the divergent strategic priorities of coalition participants, who each understood the campaign's objectives somewhat differently. Yet despite the organizational difficulties, the campaign represented genuine effort to employ coalition military power against Ottoman positions and required Ottoman commanders to respond with their full strategic capability rather than simply fielding local garrisons to deal with isolated raids. The Ottoman response to this serious coalition military challenge demonstrated the sophisticated strategic capability that decades of continuous warfare had developed within the Turkish military system, as commanders coordinated defensive operations along multiple frontiers while maintaining sufficient offensive capability to strike the coalition at its most vulnerable points. Sultan Orhan, now approaching 60 and increasingly delegating operational military authority to trusted commanders while maintaining overall strategic direction, personally oversaw the campaign's response from Ottoman headquarters, monitoring developments on multiple fronts, and making rapid decisions about force concentrations and counter-operations. The Sultan's diplomatic staff simultaneously worked to undermine coalition cohesion through approaches to individual participants offering bilateral arrangements that would serve their interests better than continued coalition commitment. The combination of military resistance on the ground and diplomatic pressure against coalition unity proved devastatingly effective, as Ottoman forces held defensive positions against coalition attacks while the diplomatic campaign progressively weakened the coalition's organizational coherence and willingness to sustain costly operations with uncertain prospects of achieving strategic objectives. The individual engagements that occurred during the coalition campaign revealed the tactical evolution of both Ottoman and Byzantine forces through decades of continuous conflict, as warriors on both sides employed techniques refined through years of practical experience in frontier warfare. Ottoman cavalry employed the mobile tactics perfected during Anatolian expansion, combining mounted archery harassment that wore down enemy formations with decisive charges at moments of maximum enemy vulnerability. The Ottoman infantry, increasingly professional and well-equipped after years of institutional development, conducted siege operations and defended positions with discipline that contrasted with the improvised character of earlier Ottoman military organization. The Byzantine forces fighting within the coalition demonstrated impressive individual courage and considerable tactical competence developed through years of defending against Ottoman expansion, yet struggled to coordinate with allies whose understanding of shared objectives and operational procedures differed significantly from Byzantine military traditions. According to historical analysis by scholars such as Mark Bartusis, whose comprehensive studies of late Byzantine military organization document the period's military capabilities in detail, the coalition's military failure reflected not inadequacy of individual participants, but rather the fundamental difficulty of coordinating diverse military forces toward common objectives when communication was slow, cultures were different, and strategic priorities conflicted. The diplomatic collapse of the coalition following the failure of the military campaign to achieve its strategic objectives revealed how fragile the alliance structures had been throughout their existence and how effectively Ottoman diplomatic efforts had undermined coalition cohesion from the beginning. each coalition partner having invested military resources and political capital in an enterprise that produced no tangible results, recalculated whether continued participation served their interests and found increasingly compelling reasons to withdraw or reduce commitment. Serbian forces, having suffered casualties in operations that advanced Byzantine strategic interests more than Serbian ones, withdrew to focus on their own territorial ambitions and internal political challenges. Venetian naval forces, having determined that continued harassment of Ottoman positions would only disrupt commercial relationships that might prove more valuable than any military gains achievable through coalition warfare, withdrew to resume diplomatic and commercial engagement with Ottoman authorities. The smaller coalition partners, observing the withdrawal of major participants, recognized that continued resistance alone could not prevent Ottoman expansion and negotiated bilateral arrangements with Ottoman authorities that preserved their own essential interests while acknowledging the reality of Turkish military dominance. The strategic significance of the coalition's failure extended far beyond immediate military outcomes to encompass fundamental recognition throughout the Byzantine world and broader Christian Europe that coordinated military resistance to Ottoman expansion had been attempted and had failed, that no realistic military option existed for reversing or even halting Turkish territorial gains, and that accommodation with Ottoman power might serve Byzantine and European interests better than continuing feudal military opposition. This recognition, though it would not immediately produce dramatic policy changes, nonetheless represented a psychological turning point in how Byzantine authorities and European Christian powers understood the situation, as the failure of the coalition represented not just one campaign's defeat but rather exhaustion of the primary military strategy available for containing Ottoman expansion. Future Byzantine responses to Ottoman pressure would increasingly emphasize diplomacy, accommodation, and creative management of the relationship with Turkish power rather than organizing military operations that could not succeed, regardless of how effectively planned or bravely executed. The years of constant Byzantine harassment, coalition operations, and frontier warfare that characterized the 1330s through 1350s created an environment of perpetual military challenge that paradoxically strengthened the Ottoman state even as it imposed significant costs in lives, resources, and administrative attention. The continuous need to defend against Byzantine attacks while simultaneously conducting offensive expansion required Ottoman military and administrative institutions to develop capabilities that purely offensive operations would never have demanded, creating a military establishment of extraordinary versatility and resilience, capable of sustaining operations across multiple fronts under conditions that would have paralyzed less adaptable military organizations. The intelligence systems developed to detect Byzantine raids and coalition operations, the supply logistics designed to sustain forces in contested territories, the garrison organizations that could defend static positions while mobile forces deployed elsewhere, and the diplomatic skills refined through managing alliance networks and exporting enemy divisions, all represented institutional capabilities that the Ottoman state would employ throughout centuries of subsequent expansion against different opponents in different geographic environments. The economic impact of perpetual conflict on both Ottoman and Byzantine states revealed how sustained low-intensity warfare differed fundamentally from the dramatic sieges and battles that dominated historical narratives, affecting populations and economies in persistent but subtle ways that accumulated over years to produce consequences as significant as any single dramatic military engagement. Ottoman coastal communities adapted to the reality of periodic Byzantine raids by diversifying economic activities, developing insurance mechanisms to cover losses from attacks, and investing in defensive infrastructure that, though expensive, enabled commerce to continue despite ongoing military threats. Byzantine populations living near Ottoman borders experienced similar adaptations, adjusting their economic activities to account for Ottoman raids and developing local defense capabilities that supplemented inadequate imperial military presence in frontier regions. The economic costs of these defensive adaptations, the garrison expenses, the fortification investments, the commercial insurance mechanisms, the disrupted seasonal agricultural work accumulated over years to represent a significant proportion of both empires' economic outputs, diverting resources from productive economic activities to defensive necessities that produce no tangible economic value beyond preventing greater losses. The military technological exchange that occurred between Ottoman and Byzantine forces through decades of continuous conflict demonstrated how prolonged contact between enemies could produce innovation as effectively as any deliberate program of technological development. Ottoman commanders observing Byzantine military techniques adopted those innovations that served Turkish purposes, Byzantine fortification principles were incorporated into Ottoman defensive architecture when they proved superior to existing Ottoman approaches. Byzantine naval tactics were studied and selectively adopted to enhance Ottoman maritime capabilities. Byzantine siege techniques were analyzed and improved upon as Ottoman engineers developed their own approaches, drawing on imperial knowledge while adding Turkish innovations. Similarly, Byzantine military experts who entered Ottoman service through capture, recruitment, or voluntary migration brought technical knowledge that enriched Ottoman military capabilities. This continuous military technical exchange, occurring through the medium of perpetual warfare rather than peacetime diplomatic or commercial contact, produced military innovation that neither side could have achieved independently. The cultural impact of living in zones of constant military conflict on the populations of both Ottoman and Byzantine territories along their shared frontiers created distinctive identities and social patterns that differed significantly from those of populations living in more stable interior regions far from the fighting. Frontier communities on both sides developed extraordinary martial traditions that made nearly every adult member of the population capable of contributing to military defense when required, blending military readiness with agricultural and commercial activities in ways that more specialized societies never developed. These frontier populations also developed distinctive cultural practices reflecting their experience of perpetual threat, architecture designed to resist sudden attack, social customs emphasizing solidarity and mutual defense, religious practices seeking divine protection against constant danger, and most significantly, pragmatic attitudes toward traditional loyalties and identities that prioritize survival over abstract political or religious commitments. The frontier culture that emerged from decades of Byzantine-Ottoman conflict would characterize populations living along the empire's boundaries throughout centuries of subsequent expansion and would produce warriors and administrators whose combination of military skill, practical intelligence, and cultural flexibility proved invaluable to the empire's continued growth. The diplomatic skills that Ottoman leaders developed through managing the complex coalition networks that Byzantine authorities assembled to resist expansion represented capabilities whose importance for the empire's long-term development exceeded their immediate military significance. The ability to identify and exploit divisions between alliance partners, to offer bilateral arrangements that served individual coalition members' interests better than continued coalition commitment, and to maintain sufficiently threatening military posture to ensure that potential allies respected Ottoman power, while simultaneously offering attractive terms that rewarded cooperation. These diplomatic capabilities would serve the Ottoman state throughout centuries of subsequent expansion when managing alliance networks, exploiting enemy divisions, and maintaining relationships with dozens of potential partners across the Mediterranean and European worlds became essential aspects of imperial strategy. The diplomatic traditions that emerged from managing Byzantine coalition operations provided training ground for Ottoman statesmen whose skills would shape the empire's relationships with European powers for generations. The military leadership development that occurred through decades of continuous frontier warfare, with commanders constantly learning, adapting, and innovating in response to an intelligent enemy that similarly learned and adapted, produced a generation of Ottoman military leaders whose capabilities reflected practical experience rather than purely theoretical military education. The commanders who rose to prominence through successful management of Byzantine harassment campaigns, coalition operations, and frontier warfare brought to their positions not just military competence but also strategic sophistication, intelligence awareness, logistical capability, and diplomatic skill that purely offensive military operations could never have developed. These capabilities, essential for managing the increasingly complex military situations that Ottoman expansion would create as the empire grew larger and faced more diverse threats, were cultivated through the unglamorous but essential process of defending Ottoman territories against Byzantine attempts to reverse expansion. The historical significance of the defensive wars against Byzantine coalitions extended far beyond their immediate military outcomes to encompass fundamental shaping of the Ottoman states, institutional development, military capabilities, and strategic culture that would influence the empire's trajectory for centuries after the specific engagements that inspired them had faded from active memory. These wars, fought in thousands of small engagements rather than a few dramatic battles, created the military infrastructure, logistical capabilities, intelligence systems, diplomatic skills, and organizational structures that would enable Ottoman expansion far beyond Byzantine Europe into the Balkans, Central Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The unglamorous reality that most military historians acknowledge, even while focusing narrative attention on more dramatic events, is that sustained, low-intensity warfare often produces more significant institutional development than periodic major operations. as the constant need to adapt to diverse challenges in real time drives innovation and capability development that peacetime exercises and occasional major campaigns cannot replicate. The Byzantine coalition operations that attempted to contain Ottoman expansion, though ultimately unsuccessful in achieving their strategic objectives, nonetheless contributed significantly to Ottoman military development by providing sustained challenges that drove institutional innovation and organizational refinement. Without the constant pressure of Byzantine harassment, coalition operations, and frontier warfare, Ottoman military development might well have stagnated, as forces designed primarily for offensive operations lack sufficient experience developing defensive capabilities essential for governing extensive territories against persistent threats. The Byzantine resistance, thus paradoxically, served Ottoman interests by creating the security challenges that demanded development of comprehensive military capabilities, and by producing the combat experience that refined Ottoman warrior skills far beyond what offensive-only warfare could have achieved. Military historians examining Ottoman institutional development have consistently identified the continuous defensive warfare against Byzantine resistance as a crucial catalyst for the military evolution that enabled later Ottoman successes against far more powerful opponents. The human cost of the decades-long defensive warfare against Byzantine coalitions, distributed across countless small engagements rather than concentrated in dramatic climactic battles, proves impossible to calculate precisely but was nonetheless substantial, involving thousands of Ottoman and Byzantine soldiers killed, wounded, or disabled during years of continuous fighting, countless civilians affected by raids, sieges, and the general disruption that constant warfare imposed on communities living in conflict zones. The soldiers who fought these wars, on both sides, rarely appear in the grand narratives of empire building and imperial decline that historians have traditionally emphasized. Their individual experiences and sacrifices subsume within broader narratives about institutional development and strategic competition. Yet these anonymous warriors, fighting daily engagements that determine the security of newly established Ottoman settlements, the continuation of Byzantine resistance, and the countless small outcomes that collectively shaped regional politics, deserve recognition as essential actors in historical processes that created and maintained the Ottoman Empire. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice, whether fighting for Ottoman expansion or Byzantine survival, represented the human reality behind the grand strategic narratives that historians construct from fragmentary surviving sources. The diplomatic lessons learned through managing Byzantine coalition operations influenced Ottoman approach to international relations for generations after the specific coalitions that inspired them had dissolved. The Ottoman model of maintaining active diplomatic relationships with all potential coalition partners individually, offering arrangements that serve their bilateral interests better than coalition commitment, and consistently exploiting divisions between alliance partners to prevent effective coordination, represented diplomatic methodology that would be refined and applied throughout subsequent Ottoman dealings with European powers. The sophistication of this approach, combining military capability to ensure potential allies respected Ottoman power with diplomatic generosity sufficient to reward cooperation and discourage opposition, proved extraordinarily effective against the fragmented political landscape of medieval and early modern Europe, and would become a defining characteristic of Ottoman foreign policy for centuries. The cultural and psychological legacy of perpetual conflict with Byzantine coalitions shaped both Ottoman and Byzantine self-understanding in ways that persisted beyond the specific military engagements. The Ottoman warrior tradition of continuous readiness, acceptance of warfare as a permanent condition, and pragmatic adaptation to diverse military challenges created military culture that valued practical competence over theoretical sophistication, collective capability over individual heroism, and institutional development over personal glory. This culture, forged in the crucible of decades of Byzantine harassment and coalition warfare, would produce a military establishment that sustained the Ottoman Empire through challenges that destroyed other empires, maintaining military effectiveness across centuries of expansion, consolidation, and eventual decline. The Byzantine tradition of brave resistance against overwhelming odds, sustained through faith in divine justice and cultural commitment to Christian civilization, created counter-narratives that preserved Byzantine identity and cultural legacy even after the empire's political existence ended, ensuring that the story of Byzantine resistance to Ottoman expansion would be told and retold through centuries of subsequent history. The final assessment of the defensive wars against Byzantine coalitions must acknowledge that these conflicts, though they received far less attention from chroniclers and subsequent historians than the dramatic conquests of cities and the pitched battles that determined immediate strategic outcomes, prove equally consequential for the long-term development of the Ottoman Empire and the transformation of southeastern European history. The institutional capabilities developed through decades of defending against Byzantine harassment, the diplomatic skills refined through managing coalition networks, the military innovations driven by constant engagement with intelligent adversaries, and the cultural attitudes forged through living and fighting in zones of perpetual conflict all shaped the Ottoman Empire that would eventually dominate the region for centuries. These contributions of unglamorous defensive warfare to the empire's development deserve recognition alongside the more celebrated achievements of siege warfare and offensive expansion, as they represent essential foundations upon which the empire's long-term greatness was built. The thousands of individual engagements that constituted the defensive wars against Byzantine coalitions collectively shaped Ottoman history as profoundly as any single dramatic event, reminding us that empires are built not just through spectacular victories, but also through the patient, persistent, daily work of defending what has been won while preparing for what remains to be conquered.